Alrighty, so hopefully you guys can all see my screen right now. What I would like to do is go ahead and get started. I've got about a 40-minute presentation prepared for everybody. I think a lot of the pre-submitted questions will be identified through this presentation. If there are any questions afterwards, what I'll do is open up that chat, start addressing the questions after that presentation. You can also raise your hand. So right now everybody is muted upon entry to the webinar, but if you raise your hand, I have the ability to unmute you. So if you want to give a little shout out or use your voice to ask a question, you can certainly do that. So we'll go ahead and get started. For those of you who I have not met or seen before, my name is Mira McBroom with the Colorado Department of Agriculture, and the folks that are helping present this today, we're with the pesticides program, right? That's why we invited everybody here today. And what we're going to be talking about is a little bit of a regulatory update in regards to the Endangered Species Act and some additional pesticide use requirements on pesticide labels from the Environmental Protection Agency. So some pretty big changes that we wanted to communicate, give you guys some tools and tips on what to keep an eye out for, and give you guys some examples and a brief background of why we're all here talking about this today. So thanks again for being here. Again, my name is Mira McBroom. I am the State Pesticide Applicator Coordinator. So this position runs everything certification and training. So that's all things licensing. And then I also run the Worker Protection Standard program. So we invited everybody here today because of these new changes to pesticide labels. And what does that mean for most of the folks on the call today? That's new requirements for pesticide applicators. So I don't know if folks have been at a workshop this season. I know there's been a lot of discussions talking about this talking about the subject that we're going over today. So you might have heard some rumblings, you might not have. So this is new, totally new information for you here today. Just know that this information is new for us as well. This is very new and forthcoming. So the information might seem a little bit overwhelming today, but these changes will be slow and over time. And there's still a lot more to come. So a few additional things before we get started is that right now these revisions are mainly going to apply to agricultural pesticide applicators. However, over time, these changes are eventually going to impact all pesticide applicators. And once again, a lot of this information is very new and forthcoming. So a lot of things today, maybe a lot of new concepts for a lot of you, but still a lot more to come. And that these changes will be slow and over time. So pesticide labels are changing, right? This is a pretty big deal, and we're going to be seeing these changes in those use directions. And the changes to these pesticide labels, as we saw in that first slide, is Endangered Species Act related. So these are going to be changes to better protect listed species, right? These threatened and endangered species and those critical habitats. So again, a very significant pesticide label change. For those of you who are familiar with the Worker Protection Standard, this is going to be the biggest change in labels and use directions since we started seeing the requirement for worker protection standards. And then once again, labels are going to be changing slowly over time. And this process is as EPA reviews and continues to review active ingredients individually. So to kind of conceptualize this, EPA, they review these active ingredients and the toxicity of those. They're also taking at that use site or that crop, and then they're also considering the impact that that might have on these endangered and threatened species, right? So that all kind of comes back to providing additional protection to those listed species. Now, quick review on the Endangered Species Act. I'm sure a lot of folks on the call today are familiar, but this was enacted in 1973 to protect fish and plants and wildlife. And this is run by or kind of managed by the services, or what's collectively known as the services. So we have the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, and then we also have the United States National Marine Fisheries Services. So under the Endangered Species Act, one cannot jeopardize that species' existence when that's deemed threatened or endangered, and then one cannot destroy or adversely modify the critical habitat of that species. Now, a federal agency like the EPA, they must consult the services if an action may affect one of the above two. So that's that species existence, or that's that designated critical habitat. And then what we're specifically talking about today, as I'm sure you guys are kind of getting the gist, right? is the use of those pesticides and EPA's registration of those pesticides. So a little bit more of why are we here today? Why is this all coming at you right now? Well, in 2011, EPA had a pretty big lawsuit filed against them. I'm sure folks might have heard rumblings about this or just rumblings of increasing litigation regarding pesticides in the EPA over the years, over the last several years, and potentially the uncertainty of the availability of pesticides, right? So that mega suit, what is commonly known as, that was filed against EPA in 2011, had an allegation that the EPA was in violation of the Endangered Species Act. And that specific allegation claimed that EPA was registering pesticides without considering the impact that that might have on these listed species. So to settle that lawsuit, to provide certainty of the availability of pesticides, and to provide certainty of the protection of these listed species, and to fulfill that obligation that EPA has for the Endangered Species Act, they developed what's called this work plan, which we'll talk about in the next slide, and they've also developed strategies. So when we talk about these strategies, EPA has developed a way to take a look at the toxicity of that active ingredient, the use site, whether that's a crop or another site, and then those listed species. So this is a way for EPA to register pesticides in a way that considers the impact that these pesticides might have on these listed species. So what does that mean for us? New compliance requirements for applicators, right? Is there a way to mitigate that application to make sure it stays on that site? That's going to provide additional protection for these species. Now let's talk about the work plan. Again, this is essentially just kind of a document that fulfills EPA's obligations for the Endangered Species Act. It ensures protection of those listed species, and it gives certainty back to pesticides in general, right? Both for those applicators and then those pesticide registrants. Now, how is the certainty going to be provided? How is this protection going to be provided? Where are we going to be seeing those label changes? The first how that I have on this bullet that you're seeing here today is the development of what's called an ecological mitigation measure. So these are actions that the pesticide applicator would take to mitigate effects to these listed species. So something that we're going to be talking about today that you're going to hear in more frequency is mitigating spray drift, right? Not a totally new foreign concept to us, but might be a little bit more robust on those pesticide labels. And then the development of mitigating runoff and erosion. So we'll be talking about that in more detail as well, but those are more like land management practices to implement. Again, making sure that that application stays on site, and it's not, contacting these sensitive areas or listed species. Excuse me. And another how that we have today is the expansion of the use of these endangered species protection bulletins. Now these are, this is a tool we already have in the tool belt. So there are some pesticide labels that have basically a statement that says, it refers you to EPA's website to see if there's any use limitation areas for an endangered species that might be in a specific geographic area. So we'll give you some examples of that, but not totally new, just not something everybody has seen before, depending on the pesticides you use and where you use them. And then again, we have these strategies, right? So as I talked about earlier, this is the lens that EPA is going to use when they register pesticides in order to provide protections to listed species. So EPA has developed a strategies for each group, so to say, of pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, and rodenticides. We have Hawaii, they have their own strategy, which we don't have to worry about. And then EPA has also prioritized mitigation for vulnerable species. So they've also implemented what's called a Vulnerable Species Action Plan. And this is more of like a proactive plan, so to say. So EPA worked with those fisheries, right? United States Fish and Wildlife, the collective fisheries, so to say. And they found 27 plant and animal species that are deemed especially vulnerable to pesticides based on geographic range, population, general susceptibility to environmental factors. So this is kind of a safety net, so to say, for those deemed vulnerable species. And what this plan really outlines is that for these vulnerable species to proactively protect them, EPA is first going to take a look at that strategy. And if that strategy does not cover a certain route of exposure or a certain use site for those specific vulnerable species, then that action plan will. So just kind of a safety net and kind of that thinking ahead. So the good news is that for all of these strategies that you're hearing about and that we're looking at today, is that EPA is taking the same framework and approach to developing these. So this is pretty straightforward, but we'll go through it really quickly. Step one is to take a look at that toxicity and other evidence to identify the potential for population level impacts. Now, when we say toxicity and other data, that's in reference to that active ingredient and those use sites, and then the population level impacts, right, those listed species. So taking a look at all of those factors together. Step two is identifying the mitigation measures needed to address the potential for population impacts. So as I alluded to on those other slides, spray drift mitigation, runoff and erosion, and endangered species protection bulletins, right? Where are these needed? That's going to lead us to step three, the identification of where these mitigations apply. Are these going to be broad, national-wide label changes, or are these going to be geographic specific areas to mitigate specific groups of species in certain areas? Now, one more thing before we move on, the endangered and the threatened species are looked at a federal level. So in Colorado, there are special Colorado protected or listed species that are not listed at that federal level. So the only species to be impacted by this are those federally listed species. So we do have some information on our website. We refer you to the federally listed species, and then Colorado Parks and Wildlife. They have both federal and state listed species. So just kind of want to differentiate between the two of those. And on our website, what we have is a list of the species that are currently being scoped by EPA to provide these additional protections to. And right now, those are all plant species. So you can take a look at those on our website as EPA lets us know, lets Colorado know what species they're going to be looking at in addition to those to scope to provide protections to, then we will update our website accordingly. Now let's take a look at the timeline. There's all these strategies. When are these being released, or when have they been released? So the herbicide strategy was actually finalized last August, so last summer. And what does that mean for today? Well, that means that any herbicide, any new herbicide, whether it's a brand new pesticide, or let's say it's an emergency exemption or special local needs, since that herbicide strategy is finalized, it's going to be registered through that lens, and we're going to start seeing those new label requirements on there: spray drift mitigation, runoff and erosion, and potentially any endangered species protection bulletins. And then we also have the finalized rodenticide strategy. So again, any new pesticide that's, brand new pesticide, or what I haven't mentioned is when pesticides are due for registration review, if that strategy's been finalized, they're going to be reviewed and registered through these lenses and with these new label requirements for pesticide applicators. Now, what we don't necessarily have quite yet is the finalized insecticide strategy. We do have the draft, and then we have yet to see the finalized, or I'm sorry, we have yet to see the draft of that fungicide strategy. So all of these pesticides have a wide variety of use sites, and one of those big questions that we got from a lot of you folks is this affecting me? What use site does this affect? And as you can see right here, and as we prefaced earlier, is that this is primarily going to affect agricultural producers. However, you can see with the rodenticide strategy and for those vulnerable species, that's either going to impact all use sites or a wide-ranging use site. So primarily what we're going to be talking about in these next few slides as far as the herbicide strategy goes are requirements for agriculture. However, this is new and evolving, and EPA does have a commitment to protect endangered species. So this may be subject to change. And of course, if those changes come down, we will communicate that with all of you. So let's take a look at these finalized strategies that we have today. So we have that finalized herbicide strategy, finalized rodenticide strategy. These next few slides, I'll kind of talk a little bit more about some label language that might be a little bit more common for herbicides. and insecticides, although we just have that draft insecticide strategy right now. It's very similar to that herbicide strategy, so we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. And this is a slide that we borrowed from the EPA. And I like this slide because it really just is that reminder that there are endangered and threatened species that are more than that just big vertebrate bald eagle that we normally think about. This includes invertebrates, aquatic species, and then if a plant is endangered, right? And then lastly, too, that concept of protecting that critical habitat. So there might be a vertebrate that depends on a plant for food or a plant for shelter, right? So this is just all encompassing of that species and what that habitat might be, food and shelter included. So the real meat and potatoes of today are these mitigation measures, right? The new label requirements for pesticide applicators. So there are 3 types of mitigation measures possible. And when I say 3 types, all 3 of these might appear on a pesticide label. So the first one we have is spray drift mitigation. This is pretty familiar for all of us today, right? Making sure that pesticide application stays on site. A heavier droplet is less prone to drift. Lowering that boom height, again, is just making sure that we're really staying on target with that application. The next one we have is that runoff and erosion mitigation. So these are more land practices, if you want to conceptualize it that way, things to implement on a field-by-field basis to make sure that that pesticide is not running off of that site and to help reduce the potential for erosion. Now, lastly, we have impacts to specific geographic areas where listed species or their critical habitat are found. And this is a pesticide use limitation area, or a PULA. So sorry to be so acronym heavy today. That's just what our federal folks have passed down. But this is those endangered species protection bulletins, right? This is the tool in the tool belt that we already have. It refers that pesticide user to what's called Bulletins Live 2, which is a website where you look up the pesticide you're using, where you're using it, and then the month of use, right? So it identifies if there's a listed species in that area or in that area at that time due to seasonality or migration or something like that. And if there's any additional steps to take to make sure you're protecting that species at that time with that pesticide. Now, these mitigations, label mandated use requirements. So how are we going to start seeing this on the label, right? What are those visual cues to start looking out for? The first one we have today is that those directions might be listed directly on the label. So mandatory spray drift requirements, if you're applying aerially or the ground boom, you must do this, right? Very direct and robust language. The next one we have on here is direct the user to BLT, Bulletins Live 2, right? Those Endangered Species Protection Bulletin, which is web-based, right? And so is this next bullet. So the next bullet says it might direct the user to what's called this mitigation menu on EPA's website. So this is fairly new. It's been out for a few months. EPA's mitigation menu is essentially a list of runoff and erosion mitigation measures that user can implement to make sure they're meeting those label requirements. Now, for at least for conventional agriculture and other use sites, as this starts to develop, is that spray drift and runoff and erosion mitigations. It's a requirement on that label, but it's determined by the pesticide used. So that active ingredient and then the site or crop, and then maybe what species are in that area if there's an endangered species protection bulletin. So a new concept we're going to throw at you is the introduction of what's called a mitigation point. So pesticide labels may have these spray drift mitigation requirements directly listed on that label, but that label might say, in order to use this pesticide on a certain crop or a use site, you need to achieve 3 runoff and erosion points. So that's going to refer you to EPA's mitigation menu. And the examples that I have for you today on pesticide labels, they do just that. They say you have to achieve this many runoff points, and then they refer you to EPA's website. So kind of a new concept as well is introducing technology-based requirements for pesticide labels. So this is pretty new as well, that I think we're going to see in more frequency. EPA's mitigation menu on their website. It's just a little bit more flexible as things develop. They can update that in a little bit more real time to address what might be coming down the pipeline. So let's take a look at spray drift mitigation measures, right? I think we're all pretty familiar with this. On the right-hand side, don't get too bogged down in reading this. This is just an example from a pesticide label with mandatory spray drift mitigations. So this isn't the entirety of that section, but as you can see, it's fairly robust and it splits it up by application type depending on how you apply. There are specific directions to implement to make sure you're mitigating spray drift. Now, other requirements that you might see on that label, just to kind of get you guys used to these ideas, are spray drift buffer requirements. So leaving an infield buffer, so that it's not drifting onto a potential sensitive area that might be adjacent to that field. There might be a windbreak requirement. And then we have the tried and true application type and equipment. So as mentioned earlier, modifying that droplet size, modifying that boom height. So things we're all familiar with, just something that might be a little bit more robust looking requirement on that label, so to say. So next we have these runoff and erosion mitigation measures. As you can see on this slide, there's a lot of options here. These are more land practice management mitigations. So from a field management perspective, what type of irrigation methods are implemented? Is there a cover crop? There is this concept of what type of soil you have. What does that slope look like, right? The probability for runoff. Application parameters. Can you reduce that application rate? So there's a lot on here. We're not going to get bogged down too much, but as mentioned earlier, the pesticide label says you have to achieve 3 runoff and erosion points. But at least the labels that I've seen so far, I don't want to make any promises, is that it tells you how many points you have to meet or you have to achieve, but it doesn't tell you exactly what you need to implement. So this is where I see we potentially have the most flexibility. And from that crop production standpoint, are there things that that agricultural producer is already doing that they are reducing runoff and erosion? It's just a matter of identifying what that is and making sure you're compliant with these pesticide labels as they continue to be reviewed and updated. Now, again, I do apologize for the screenshots. Might be a little bit challenging to see, but these are these mandatory runoff mitigations. So both of these labels say that you must achieve a minimum of 3 points to use this on the crop uses listed. So both of these pesticide labels refer you to that mitigation menu. And then the label on the right-hand side also tells you, hey, you need to go check and see if there's an endangered species protection bulletin. So we'll go through some of these examples here in the coming slides, but again, just kind of getting those eyeballs used to what this label language is going to look like and what you need to start kind of putting into action. So mitigation menu and point system, I apologize if this is challenging to see on your end, so just bear with me. I'm going to kind of explain this. This is linked on our website, so you can take a closer look at and not be as distracted by reading what is probably small text for you. But the table on the left-hand side lists a slew of mitigation measures to implement. The middle column gives you like basically to the extent that you implement it. From the example that we have here today is reducing that annual application rate. The middle column explains that if you reduce it between 10 to 30 or 30 to 60 or greater than 60%, then you achieve a certain, like a different level of points for that, right? So the greater that that annual application rate is reduced, then the greater number of points that that pesticide user is achieving. So when you have a time, go ahead and look through all of these. We're not going to read through all of these, but a lot of options on there. This mitigation menu tells you how many points you get for which strategy you implement. Now, again, the label dictates the points required. And what we want to talk about, again, another new concept is the idea of what's called relief point. So a relief point is something that will be automatically applied based on those field characteristics. So because we're talking about runoff, EPA took a look at the continuous US, right, the lower 48 states, and they took a look at soil type and that vulnerability for runoff. And they said, you know what, based on these soil types, that's looked at on a county by county basis, because if there's low runoff vulnerability, then EPA is going to just give you some free quote unquote relief points based on that low runoff vulnerability. So here's the map where it's super easy to see where Colorado is. But as you can see, or maybe not see, Colorado has a very low runoff vulnerability. So that means we get some freebie relief points for runoff. EPA has also released a table of what this looks like. It has every county in those lower 48 states, but in Colorado, because of our soil type and that low runoff vulnerability, each county in Colorado is automatically awarded 3 points. And I know it's challenging to see, but there are some counties that have very low runoff. They're awarded 6 points. So for the example of the pesticide label we saw earlier, it said you must achieve 3 runoff points to use this pesticide on this crop. Well, because we have these 3 relief points for any county in Colorado, there's no additional mitigations that that person would have to implement for runoff mitigation. Now, if the label requires 6 runoff points, and for example, you are applying that pesticide in Adams County, then you get 3 relief points, but you still have to achieve another 3 runoff points to be compliant with that label. Now, a few other things on EPA's mitigation menu. I don't want you to get too bogged down in this or trying to read it if it's too small for you, but I just wanted to bring up the question of tracking. So I have all these points that I need to achieve to use it on my crop. Am I supposed to track this? Well, right now, there's no requirement to. There's no requirement on the federal level, and then there's no requirement on the state level. But as somebody who's an inspector for many years, I'm going to strongly encourage this and recommend it. However, on EPA's mitigation menu, mitigation tracking, document at the field or farm level using paper or electronic format, you get a freebie point for doing that. So just kind of the heads up for that. And then on the right-hand side, just something that I wanted to remind myself to talk about with folks today is working with an expert or a conservation program. There are certain parameters that has to meet, especially for the conservation program. But a technical expert, an example would be working with a certified crop advisor. So if you're working with, for example, a certified crop advisor to determine these points, spray drift mitigation measures, as long as you document that, there's no formal documentation for that, but you do get a point for working with that technical expert. And if you're in a qualifying conservation program that meets the following characteristics, I'm not going to go through that today, but you get 2 points for that. This is an either or, so you don't get points if you work with both, but you do get points if you do one of the 2. Now, for tracking mitigations, EPA has created a runoff points calculator. So that is in the format of a spreadsheet. It's very similar to that mitigation menu where it has these measures, the extent of in which it's implemented, and then the points achieved, and it helps tally that for you. And then they do have an accompanying user guide to go with that. That's a PDF for you. So switching gears a little bit, we're going to be talking about the rodenticide strategy, and then we'll go into some examples for the Endangered Species Protection Bulletins. So the rodenticide strategy differs a little bit, right? So reading through this, EPA say that the routes of implementation for these additional protection to listed species are likely going to be in the form of those Endangered Species Protection Bulletins and those PULAs, right? That pesticide use limitation area. Now, some possible mitigation measures that you might see are the prohibition of broadcast and below ground in-burrow applications where needed to protect listed species, post-application carcass search, post-application requirements to address any bait that was spilled or that was kicked out by that pest, and then covering burrow holes after the application for closed burrow systems. Now, for those of you who have used rodenticides, covering a burrow hole is nothing new. Just something we might see an increased frequency, and then same with post-application carcass search. So not totally new things, just something you might be doing a little bit more often. Now, a few other things I wanted to address. There's been a lot of rumblings about the possibility of restricted use classification for rodenticides. And what EPA said in the strategy is that there are some mitigation measures that are going to be addressed during registration review. So you can consider this kind of like a case-by-case basis. So the first possibility we have is that restricted use classification, packaging in less quantities for some bait stations. And then we have what could potentially be broad national product labeling for some pesticides that prohibit applications in certain areas like turf, lawns, campsites, stuff like that. So again, These are just going to be on a case-by-case basis, but the possibility for these mitigations. Now let's take a look at the Endangered Species Protection Bulletin. So again, just kind of a screenshot from a product called Rosal Prairie Dog Bait, a rodenticide. There's the EPA registration number for you. But what this screenshot shows you here today is that to use this product, you must follow the measures in that Endangered Species Protection Bulletin for the area that you're applying that product. Now, you can obtain the bulletin up to 6 months in advance to using that product, but you cannot obtain a bulletin after the fact, right? And that's, if you need to for whatever reason, that's where you call that number on here. But otherwise, you pull the bulletin from their website. But we shouldn't have to look at a bulletin in the past because we want to be looking at this before we use that product to identify any additional use limitations. So when you go to Bulletins Live 2, this is what it looks like. Now at the top here, what we also have listed on our website is a tutorial on how to use this. Now I'll kind of give you the truncated version through just kind of explaining through some slides. But again, EPA does have that tutorial if you want to go ahead and view that. So what we see here on that map, those pink blobs, those pink squares, so to say, these are our PULAs. These are our pesticide use limitations area. You can click on those and see the details of it. But I'm going to kind of quickly run through how to look up a limitation for that pesticide referenced, that Rosal Prairie Dog Bait. So on the left-hand side in the bottom, it says location search, application month, and EPA registration number. Those are pretty straightforward. For location search, if you do not have a physical address, you can use latitudes and longitudes. As we all know, you may not be applying that product in an area where it has a legal address. Now, I did look up one for Rosal Prairie Dog Bait, and there is a limitation for that selected area. So what I did is northeast of Denver, there's the tiniest little pink square rectangle type of thing, and we're going to view the bulletin for that. So what I did to view that formal bulletin is at the top right-hand side, it says printable bulletin in a green rectangle. And when you click that, you get this formal bulletin that lets you know of the use limitations in that area. So as you can see, March 2025, Rosal Prairie Dog Bait with the associated registration number. And the limitation for this is pretty straightforward. It's just straight prohibition of use. Rosal Prairie Dog Bait use is prohibited in this area. Now know that stuff like this might be dependent on seasonality. So while it might be prohibited in March, and don't quote me on this, I believe this product, quite sure it's allowed in other times of the year. So just kind of an example of what this might look like and how it might change seasonally. Now let's take a look at another PULA. So some comments that folks gave to EPA when they were developing these strategies and kind of were letting folks know, hey, we're probably going to see more PULAs, right? These pesticide use limitation areas. Well, the comment made to EPA was, okay, if we're going to see this in increased frequency, what we don't want to see are these giant blobs of prohibition of use, right? So what folks really wanted to see more than anything is making sure that these use limitation areas are very specific to that geographic area and those critical habitats. So as this develops, this might be something similar to what we start to see to protect these listed species. Now, I want to show an example of a PULA that has instructions that are not just prohibition of use. So this is an example of a product, of a dicamba product somewhere in the Midwest. But as you can see, again, I'm not going to read it out loud to you, don't worry too much, but in the code and limitations table, there's a bunch of directions that folks have to do to make sure they're protecting the listed species in that area, additional, like a spray drift buffer, stuff like that. So what I want to emphasize with here is that these code and limitations, this pesticide use limitation area, this is not in substitute of what's already on that label. So if the label has spray drift mitigation measures, if it has runoff and erosion mitigation requirements, and an endangered species protection bulletin, these limitation directions, these use directions, this is in addition to what's on that label already. This is not in substitute of. So just kind of trying to give you guys an all-encompassing example. And then let's talk about the when, right? The biggest question everybody has is, when are we going to start seeing this, and how soon? So again, I want to emphasize that any new pesticide that's registered, that strategy's been finalized, it's going to be registered through that lens. We're going to see these label changes. Otherwise, if a pesticide is up for review, which EPA reviews each registered pesticide at least every 15 years, then during that registration review process, we're going to see these new label requirements. So again, it's going to be kind of a slow rollout over time. And then the registration review schedules. So EPA on their website, which again is linked through ours, they have a schedule of when each active ingredient is due for review. So you guys are able to check that out. It may be subject to change. EPA does a good job of updating that as those changes occur. But again, as they're up for review, they're going to be registered through the lens of these finalized strategies. Another question is can we weigh in? And the answer is yes. So the registration review process, reviewing these active ingredients, it is a public process, and you're able to submit comments to the EPA. So on our website, where we forward you guys to that registration review schedules, on the left-hand side, there's a link to sign up to comment. You guys can also sign up for kind of being in the know. So there's a pesticides program email blast updates that EPA has. So you can sign up for those as well and just kind of get that information as they start to review things and let folks know if you do want to comment, you certainly are able to do. Now let's take a look at a few herbicides registered in Colorado with mitigation measures. So on the right-hand side, I'm going to focus on two special herbicides. One of them is an emergency exemption. The other one's a special local needs. And since these are somewhat newly registered with us or with the EPA, these have these mitigation requirements because that herbicide's been finalized, right? And then on the left-hand side, we have a product called Liberty Ultra, again, another herbicide. This is a glufosinate P product, and this is not a special registration. This is just what we call a Section 3, a normally registered pesticide, right, available to the use sites on that label. It does require 3 runoff mitigation points, requires a windbreak if certain measures aren't met, but there's no PULAs, right? There's no pesticide use limitation areas. Now, again, let's kind of hark back to that example of those relief points, right? So for Liberty Ultra, it requires 3 runoff mitigation points. Because we're applying this pesticide in any county in Colorado, we're meeting those requirements with those relief points based on our soil type in Colorado. Now that there might still be some spray drift mitigation requirements and that windbreak if certain measures aren't met. So just kind of hopefully providing an example for everybody. And then just a few closing remarks. Again, that reminder that this is very new and evolving. Changes are going to happen slow and gradually over years. And then agricultural producers and eventually other applicators, you're going to have to start looking at drift, runoff, and erosion and these pesticide use limitation areas on a field-by-field basis or a use site-by-use site basis. Now, lastly, staying up to date, this QR code will take you to our new Endangered Species Act website. Please continue to check that. We're going to put more information up that as we receive it. We're going to put this webinar on there, so if folks weren't able to attend today, or if you have colleagues or other folks you want to share it with, this will be available hopefully soon after this, or later this week, early next week. And then any pertinent information may come in that email blast. So like everybody who got that invite today, keep an eye out for stuff like that. And then we will host additional webinars as needed. So if there's any big updates or changes, we'll get on another call like this and host a few of these and update you guys this way. So this concludes the presentation. What I'll go ahead and do is stop sharing my screen, and then I'm going to open it up to the chat and see what you guys got for me. So thank you for listening. And let's see here. Okay, so I did get a question submitted. It says, can we explain the differences or the difference between an Endangered Species Protection Bulletin and a PULA? So these, while they're not the same thing, they're related. So an Endangered Species Protection Bulletin, I should not stop sharing my screen. But a bulletin is that formal bulletin that you print. The use limitation area are those pink areas. So that bulletin shows you what that pesticide use limitation area is. And I will get a visual cue up here and just kind of re-show you guys those slides. So give me just a second. Okay. All right. So this is a pesticide use limitation area, these pink areas. So this indicates that certain products have a limitation in this specific area, and it might be a specific time of year. Now, this printable bulletin up here in the right-hand corner, that takes you to this actual bulletin, right? Now, in Colorado, our commercial applicators, if there's a bulletin in effect for the pesticide they're using, they have to retain this for their records. If there's not a bulletin in effect, they don't need to maintain that, but they do need to be checking this if it's on the label. And now private applicators, there is no record keeping requirement for this. But again, as a previous inspector, I recommend if that pesticide label has this statement on there and you have to check the bulletin, our recommendation is to keep a record of that bulletin to show that if there is a PULA, which are these pink areas, if there's a use limitation in effect, that you are following these use directions, or if there are none at that time, you're showing us that you did your due diligence by looking up that information to see if there's any use limitation areas. So hopefully that helps. Feel free to ask me to elaborate if that did not help. So yeah, there we go. Perfect. Yep, so commercial applicators are required to maintain a copy of the Endangered Species Bulletin with their records if the application is made within the period of time that the bulletin is active. So, and I'll leave my contact information up here as well. So if folks have questions, you can give me a call or shoot me an email. So, but not a whole lot of questions coming through, but I'm happy to stay on for a little while to let folks digest and answer any questions that folks have. Does the same apply to public applicators? That's correct. So this is a label mandated requirement. So if those label directions apply to the site of application, right, the crop or site, or if those directions apply to the application that you're making, then this does apply to you. Did that answer that question? Was I speaking too broadly? Feel free to have me elaborate. There you go. Yeah, so the record keeping requirements, if you're talking about that Endangered Species Protection Bulletin, yeah, that does apply to public applicators as well. To registered public applicators, I should say. You're welcome. Oh, I apologize. I'm neglecting some hands raised. Joan, I have you at the top right here. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. You're able to unmute. So go ahead and ask your question. And then we've got another hand raised, so I'll address that here shortly. Hey, Joan, I see that you're unmuted, but if you are speaking, we are unable to hear you. You there, Joan? Joan, we can't hear you.
Joan, you may have to go into the little microphone on your audio and choose your microphone that you're using for the Zoom.
Thank you, Joan. Yep, we had a question in the chat that says if there are no endangered species bulletins for your site, an application period not required to print. That's correct, but we still strongly encourage it just to make sure you guys are taking a look at that bulletin. All right, we have another hand raised. His name is Bryce. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you as well. So while Joan's addressing her microphone, we'll see if Bryce is able to go ahead and give us a chat. You're able to unmute yourself, and if you have a question, just let us know. Yeah, so a question came in, curious about the mitigation points for reducing application. Seems like it would be limited in consecutive years. For example, I'm spraying at the lower end of the recommendation rate, and if I reduce by 10 to 30% each year, I will eventually be outside of the recommendation rate. So that's a good question. So if you're already reducing that rate, you're already probably achieving these runoff points, right? So reducing by 10 to 30%, that's of the labeled rate already. So that doesn't mean you have to do anything in consecutive years. So let's say you're already applying at 60% below the labeled rate, based on that table that I showed you earlier, you're going to get 3 points to do that. At that same rate, right? As long as that pesticide label rate doesn't change and you keep applying at that reduced rate, you don't have to reduce every year, right? It's just taking a look at each year as a whole, if that kind of makes sense. So we don't expect folks to keep reducing every year and every year. It's just reducing that annual application rate looking at that year. You're welcome. Thanks, Courtney. Another question, will this affect a lot over-the-counter rodenticides sold to the public, such as Prozac for moles and gophers? I'll be honest, it might. I don't think we have that information right now. Because as far as I know, I don't think we've seen any newly registered pesticides or registration review with these new use requirements. But what I will refer back to is that table I showed you guys earlier, is that rodenticides are going to be affected by all use sites. So there is certainly the potential for that to affect what's being sold to the public. Alrighty, well, I'll let it linger for a little bit while longer. Still not seeing a whole lot of questions come through, but we're here for it if you have anything that comes up here over the next few minutes. You're welcome. Thanks for attending. We had a pretty good attendee record here these last few days, so I appreciate everybody's willingness to participate. I know this is starting to be the busy season for everybody here today, so I appreciate for those who were able to make the time. Otherwise, like I said, this will be posted on our website. So again, appreciate all of you here today and the engagement that you've provided. So I think I'm going to go ahead and stop the webinar. I'm not seeing a lot of questions come through. I'm seeing people start to trickle out of the meeting. So Thanks everybody for being here today. You have my contact information. Make sure you keep an eye out for our website and we will pass along any updates accordingly as discussed today. So thank you everybody and have a wonderful rest of the day today.